All right, good afternoon. Thank you all for being here for the third installment of the Energy University. I do believe we're going to have diplomas distributed at the conclusion for everybody who is attending all three.
We may not be an accredited college, but
you can take it.
We will give degrees.
Well, those are in fashion these days. Well, thank you all for being here. Our purpose throughout the entire event, this presentation, has been bringing together experts, policymakers, grassroots activists, and organizations, and a handful of folks from the public. Thank you for being here. To make sure that we can have a conversation about what it'll take to meet our urgent clean energy goals here in the great state of Wisconsin. We have learned together that Wisconsin is not going fast enough, and that the Public Service Commission is making that transition harder, not easier, and that this legislature must actively work to fund and advance clean energy projects to meet this moment.
Specifically, Energy University is built around the following three premises that every reasonable person in Wisconsin can agree on. One, the climate crisis is real, and it's hitting Wisconsin hard. We all understand that the only way to solve the climate crisis is to transition to 100% clean energy, clean renewable energy, and a clean renewable energy economy as quickly as possible. That transition must be just, driven by union labor, and it must center both the energy workers of today and the energy workers of our future. Two, this is not optional. It's an emergency and one we must confront. The people in Wisconsin need to rapidly change this state's outdated energy policy and portfolio in order to address the climate crisis. And then three, artificial intelligence and data centers are already greatly increasing our energy demand. Convincing Wisconsin's utilities to build out fossil fuel energy sources, regardless of our individual or organizational views on artificial intelligence or data centers, the consequences of AI and data centers for our workers, or on the necessity of building more fossil fuels infrastructure mid-climate crisis, this trend will make 100% clean energy, our 100% clean energy economy goal much harder to achieve.
So we are honored to host panelists with a range of expertise and viewpoints, and we have a range of viewpoints represented in the audience here too. We need productive, respectful conflict to unstick the broken status quo. But we're confident in time that we will all agree on the same basic path forward. We just can't take too much time because we've already waited far too long. Also, if you have questions, please submit them on the green slip from the registration table being held up by Justin Sargent. Thank you so much. We have staff who can provide additional slips, and they will collect them and get them to the moderator for our Q&A.
So let's talk about our moderator. Our featured speaker is Dr. Leah Stokes, and Dr. Leah Stokes is the Anton Vonk Associate Professor of Environmental Politics in the Department of Political Sciences and affiliated with the Environmental Studies Department at the University of California, Santa Barbara. In 2020, she published Short-Circuiting Policy, which examines the role that utilities have played in promoting climate denial and rolling back clean energy laws. Her book was named the best energy book of 2020 by the American Energy Society and listed as a top climate book by the New York Times. She also contributed to the anthology All We Can Save, which serves as a senior policy counsel at Rewiring America, and co-hosts the podcast A Matter of Degrees. I know what I'm going to be listening to after this session. And then our moderator, Courtney Bradley, is the director of state campaigns at Evergreen Action, where she leads multi-state clean energy efforts with a strong focus on the Midwest. She specializes in building broad coalitions, shaping state policies, shaping state policy scenarios, and advancing decision maker education on energy sitting, transmission, and clean mobility.
And then we have our two panelists. First, we have Dr. Paul Wilson. He is the Grainger Professor of Nuclear Engineering in the University of Wisconsin-Madison's Department of Nuclear Engineering and Engineering Physics. His research focuses on developing improved tools for computational modeling of complex nuclear energy systems with applications in radiation shielding, nuclear waste management, and nuclear non-proliferation and energy policy. Dr. Wilson also serves on the executive committee of the Wisconsin Energy Institute and the governance committee of the Nelson Institute for Environmental Studies. And then lastly, we have Dr. Jonathan Patz, MD and PH. He is the Vilas Distinguished Achievement Professor and the John P. Holton Chair of Health and the Environment with appointments in the Nelson Institute for Environmental Studies and the Department of Population and Health Sciences. Heck of a business card. For 15 years, Pat served as a lead author for the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and he has also co-chaired the Health Expert Panel of the U.S. National Assessment on Climate Change. So if we could give a loud round of applause to all of our featured speakers and guests. I'll take it off to them. Thank you.
And can we all see these slides? Thumbs up from people I can see? Fabulous. Okay, great. Well, it's so wonderful to be here. Kudos to you for going back to Energy University with these amazing speakers and the ones in previous sessions as well. My name is Leah Stokes, and I am a professor at UC Santa Barbara, where I work on climate and clean energy policy. Just as a note, I'm not affiliated anymore with Rewiring America, so I just wanted to be clear about that. And I do this research with Eric Massenet, who is an engineer and the Mellenchamp Chair and Professor, and really one of the world-leading experts in industrial decarb. He's also affiliated right now with the Department of Energy, where he's been working on these issues as well. And we have a team of policy and postdocs who are key collaborators on this project, and many of them have joined on the call today too. So if there's follow-up questions to anything that I say and we don't have a chance to get to them today, know that this is research that we're working on right now, and we would love to hear from you and partner with you to think more about how Wisconsin can take a bite at this pollution source. And I'll just say, in the context of the data centers and AI conversation, which I know is a top of mind for folks in terms of electricity demand growth, industrial facilities are another source of oncoming electricity demand growth, and in my view, a rather important source. This is an essential part of our economy. Manufacturing obviously creates good paying jobs, often unionized, and we need to electrify the sources of emissions from this sector. So this is another place where we're going to have increasing electricity demand, sort of like when we electrify buildings, when we electrify transportation. It's the same kind of thing, but for the industrial sector. So when we think about how we should be using every kilowatt hour, we've got to be using them wisely, and electrifying the industrial sector is a key thing to do. Okay, so what are we talking about here? So when we talk about industry as a sector within the economy, right? We have electricity, we have transportation, buildings, and then we often use this term industry. So, and so residential and commercial in this picture is buildings that we're talking about here. So you can see the industrial sector is using about a third of the energy in the economy right now in Wisconsin. Now, since energy is highly correlated with emissions, hopefully not someday in the future, you can imagine that it's also similar in terms of the emission sources. So what are we talking about here? Well, here's an example of sort of a simplified process for what we might call wet corn milling. This is an example of one of the subsectors that we model in our work. So you're going to put corn into it. It's going to go through a series of processes: steeping, grinding, drying, and refining. And you'll see here that in certain parts of those processes, heat is involved. The way that heat usually is created in these industrial processes is through burning natural gas, or methane as another word for the term. And that basically combustion on site is the heat that we need to do these processes. So a lot of industrial pollution, 3/4 of it actually comes from this heat process, making heat on site. The other, quarter of pollution that we're talking about from the industrial sector is when greenhouse gases are created as a byproduct of chemical reactions. So you can think about cement, for example. When you're creating cement, you create some pollution as a byproduct. It's not the goal. It's just something that happens in the chemical process. So what we are going to be talking about here is how we can use alternative heat sources to make these processes without pollution. So as you can imagine, just like you've been talking about with electricity, industrial pollution harms communities, right? So as we are burning fossil fuels on site in these manufacturing and industrial facilities, they are emitting pollution. Those pollution sources include sulfur dioxide, nitrous oxides, and these pollutants cause respiratory diseases and smog. So they affect nearby communities. You can also think of small particles like PM 2.5. These are emitted by these facilities, and they enter, of course, lungs and bloodstreams. They cause asthma and lung cancer because they're really, really tiny particles that can move throughout our body. And of course, they're also emitting greenhouse gases such as carbon dioxide and methane when we have this sort of leakage throughout the supply chain. And of course, those cause climate change or global warming. So the good news is that we can stop burning fossil fuels in these industrial facilities. And the sectors that we focus on in our work are what we would call low to medium temperature processes. What do I mean by that? Well, oftentimes when people think about the industrial sector, they're thinking about things like steel or aluminum, which require really, really high temperatures. That's not what we're talking about. There are many processes that actually use lower to medium temperature heat. So in the centigrade scale, something like 100 degrees centigrade or 150. These are not very high heat temperatures. Remember, you boil water at 100 degrees, right? So the sectors that we look at in our work, the three big sectors that have low to medium temperature processes are chemicals. And in Wisconsin, that means we're talking about ethanol or ethyl alcohol as a synonym, pulp and paper, again, a major industry in Wisconsin, and food and beverages. And in the case of Wisconsin, you can think, of course, of cheese and breweries and things like that. So these are sectors that are using heat, but they're not doing it at a super high temperature like you would think for steel or aluminum. So when we look at Wisconsin's manufacturing emissions, where are they coming from? So there's a relatively small slice from food and beverage. So those were things like I mentioned, like breweries and cheese and things like that. Ethanol production is about 10%. And then pulp and paper makes up a really big chunk of the emissions, about half. So that's a place where significant progress could be made. Other manufacturing here is things like glass and aluminum and things that are outside of the scope of what we're looking at. Okay, so where are these facilities? Well, they're scattered all throughout the state, as you can imagine, because there are people making things everywhere, which is great, but we want to help folks make things without pollution. So we're looking at facilities that are in the federal GHGRP database, which, just as a side note, the Trump administration has decided to stop collecting information from these facilities going forward, which will make it harder for us to even understand what is happening. So how can we electrify Wisconsin's industrial heat? That's the goal here, right? You've probably realized that to make a big difference on climate change, we have to do two big things. We have to clean up the electricity system, which you've been focusing a lot on, and then we have to electrify everything we can. When we talk about electrification, you're probably more familiar with things like an electric vehicle, electrifying the transportation sector, or a bus, trucks. You might think about buildings, putting in a heat pump water heater, an induction stove. Well, we can do the same kind of thing in an industrial process, and that's what we're going to talk about today. The two main technologies that we can use in these industrial facilities are industrial electric boilers, which are equivalent to, in a building context, using an electric resistance heater. So if you're familiar, the southeast of the United States actually has almost all electrified heating of buildings, but they use it via electric resistance. And the downside of doing that is a very inefficient technology. So it is not expensive to install, but then to operate it, it costs more money because it doesn't, for every kilowatt hour you put into this electric boiler, it doesn't make that much heat. The second technology, which shows more promise, is a high temperature industrial heat pump. You can basically think of this like a heat pump that you would put in a home, right? Remember, these can both heat and cool buildings, but you can put it in an industrial facility. And rather than burning things or converting kilowatt hours into heat via a resistance, what they're doing is sort of moving heat around. And by moving heat around, it's way more efficient. So you might have heard things like it's 400% efficient. And when we say something like that, we're taking a benchmark of another technology and we're saying how many more times efficient than that technology is it? So we're talking about 3 to 4 times more efficient than other technologies. So these heating systems are already being deployed. We give some examples here of specific facilities where there are electric technologies being installed in the United States. So there are examples for pulp and paper, again, a really big part of the Wisconsin story. There is examples for ethanol in Western New York, and there are examples for beer brewing in the case of Colorado. So basically what we're showing you here, and you can see the temperature ranges that they're going up to around 200 degrees centigrade. And so these are possible to use today. Now, there's of course barriers, and we're going to talk about what those are. So what are we doing in this research project? What we're doing is a very technical modeling exercise. We're just actually about 12 months into this project, and I think it was yesterday or 2 days ago, the team finished modeling all the 40-something NACS codes, which means the subsectors of the industrial processes. So it took a long time, but what did we actually do? Well, what we did was we gathered all the data that we could that's publicly available, like the GHGRP database, which basically is showing how much emissions different facilities have, air permit data, et cetera. We then built a database of what are the electric technologies that could be used, and we critically created these process system archetypes. I'm going to show you what that looks like, but you can think of it as like a little model that we're building on a computer that helps us create a digital twin of how a facility operates. So all the steps involved in creating paper, all the steps involved in brewing beer, and which part of those take in energy, create emissions, how does the actual process work, so that we can model on a computer how these things work. And we can show, okay, in the baseline where they're burning fossil fuels on site, here's what the model looks like. And then when we electrify it, here's how much we save in pollution. But here's how much costs go up, and here's how much electricity demand increases. So we can see what the change looks like through electrification. So let's jump into looking at one of these archetypes. See, it takes a long time to make these things. So this is an example of how ethanol is produced, right? And you can see that basically there's a boiler house that is taking in natural gas, and of course heat is coming out of that, and then that heat is driving this process. As a byproduct, emissions are coming out, right? Because as we burn that natural gas, we're creating pollution. Now, the rest of the process involves a number of steps, but you'll notice that at the top right, there's also a drum dryer. Again, natural gas is going into that dryer process. You can think of this like if you had a natural gas clothing dryer in your home. Those do exist. It's a similar kind of thing. You're burning gas in that dryer directly. So there's 2 places in this process where fossil fuels are being burned. So what could we do? Well, one option is we could use electric boilers, which is that technology I mentioned that isn't as efficient. And we could swap out the gas boiler with the electric boiler, and we could swap out that gas dryer for an electric resistance dryer. Now, the downside, as I mentioned, is the operating costs are higher when you do this, but the upfront capital costs are lower. And the footprint of building these things is actually very similar, so it's an easy swap. The second thing we could do instead, which is probably a better idea, as I'll show you in the results, is we could put a heat pump in there. So rather than using a boiler on site that burns fossil fuels, we could have a heat pump, and we can also swap out that electric resistance dryer. And there's also heat pump dryers as well. Now, the really key thing that our process is also looking at is the additional efficiency improvements. So these plants, as you can imagine, they are often old, they're very intricate, and certain parts of them, they get less efficient over time. So if you think about a house, right, you could have a really efficient heat pump that you installed, but maybe some of these windows are a bit leaky and you don't have insulation in the roof, right? And so there are efficiency upgrades you could make at the house that would make the envelope of the building tighter and make less of that heat leak. It's the same thing in an industrial process, right? There's all this heat being lost through these efficiency weaknesses in the process. And there are ways that you could go through a plant and do a big efficiency upgrade through things like thermal insulation that would allow you to keep more of the heat, which would make that heat pump operate even more. And so we're looking at those efficiency gains too, these deep retrofits that could be done of plants. Of course, again, there's a capital cost, upfront to doing that, but then there's efficiency gains down the road. And this is important when we think about new electricity demand, right? Trying to minimize that by doing efficiency as well. Okay, we also build this for pulp and paper, and I just want to point out that a pulp and paper process is a bit more complicated because not only are we burning fossil fuels, we're also burning byproduct fuels, right? So if you're familiar with pulp and paper, basically we're using part of the wood itself, like to create an energy source, black liquor, and then we are burning that on site. And there's also parts of pulp and paper where we're using part of the wood to create a chemical process to actually make paper. So not all of a pulp and paper plant can be fully electrified. So if, for example, we swap out that gas furnace for an electric boiler or a heat pump, there are still parts of this process that are not electrified. You see the Stoker boiler, for example. You see the lime kiln. A lime kiln is a process that can help make things white, and it requires really high temperatures. So something like hydrogen might be necessary for on-site combustion of a lime kiln to still get those high temperatures, and you can't really just use a heat pump because it's too high of a temperature. So I just want to point out that for pulp and paper, and you'll see this in the results, we don't fully eliminate emissions through electrification. Okay, so let's talk about the results. So essentially, under the baseline, you can see in this pink, under the current grid mix, if we don't make the grid cleaner, putting in electric boilers, which are those less efficient technologies that I talked about, actually increases emissions. If the grid is cleaner, that's not the case, emissions fall. But this is because those electric boilers are not very efficient and the grid is dirty, right? So we're sort of like burning gas upstream in the grid, and then we're bringing it to the site, and then we're not using that electricity that efficiently. By contrast, even under the grid today, with no additional cleaning up of the grid, air source heat pumps plus energy efficiency bring down emissions in all of the sectors. You see, they don't do it quite as much in pulp and paper because of some of those biogenic emissions. Now, the cool thing about heat pumps is that as the grid gets cleaner, so do these industrial facilities, right? So you can see that we get pretty deep cuts in emissions for things like ethanol and food and beverage and pulp and paper as the grid cleans up. And this graph is showing you cumulative emissions. So it's kind of saying, taking the dirty emissions of today and adding that in, and then as the grid gets cleaner, adding those in as well. So what is the benefit of doing this? Well, there's an enormous amount of health benefits, and you might hear more about that from another speaker today, in terms of avoided lost work days, asthma cases, school days, etc. So it will make people a lot healthier, to say nothing of, the climate crisis. Now, the big point that I want to make sure that everybody understands today is that the electricity system, the cost of electricity is too high and probably only getting higher. So the industrial rate, about 8 cents a kilowatt hour, is almost 2 times as high as what it would need to be for these heat pumps to be cost competitive. So what we really need is a preferential rate for facilities that electrify so that they can save money by electrifying. Because gas basically is much cheaper than electricity. You can see this again here, that if, for example, Wisconsin, the legislature were to create a subsidy program where it helped pay for the upfront capital costs of electrifying, you can see that in some of these scenarios too, where it says CapEx minus 50% or CapEx minus 100%, that would not solve the problem. The operating cost would be too high. So it's only when you get to scenarios where the operating costs are subsidized, meaning you cut that kilowatt hour by about half, from 8 cents a kilowatt hour to 4 for the industrial processes, that you start to get these projects in the money. You get pretty much all of them in the money. You see this again here. The percentage of the electrifiable emissions that we can get in the money goes up to about 50% if electricity is subsidized and if there's a sort of upfront program. So what do these policies look like, just as I wrap up here? So the number one thing that I think folks in Wisconsin need to think about is creating a beneficial utility rate structure for facilities using clean industrial heat. What does this mean? It's like, and this is something that the Public Service Commission would need to do, maybe in concert with the legislature, but it's similar to EV utility rates. So at my home, I have an EV, so I pay less to charge it. My electricity rates are lower. That can also be the case. Facilities that electrify could get a 4 cent a kilowatt hour rate rather than the 8 cents. The second thing that Wisconsin could do is modeled after other states like California and Colorado and Pennsylvania, which is a program to give upfront support for capital investments in these clean technologies. So the California program is something like $90 million. The Colorado one is, I think, 168. And the Pennsylvania one is actually a federal program where they got about $300 million. But helping to support these things is really important. There's also things that can be done under the National Ambient Air Quality Standards. You can look at the example of Los Angeles there, putting requirements, but that's not going to help on the cost side of things. One other thing I want to mention is that if you're worried about the continual operating costs because electricity is expensive, geothermal is another opportunity. It's a higher upfront capital invest, and it also has a bit more risk, but the government could, for example, create pilot programs to see if geothermal could be used, and then they would have a much lower operating cost going forward. Data centers, I know, is on everyone's mind. You could theoretically co-locate data centers near these industrial facilities such that the waste heat that's coming out of these servers could be used in industrial facilities, and some of that cooling could go back into the data centers. That's sort of an idea that would require industrial co-location, but it's something that I know folks are talking about. So hopefully I didn't go on too long, and hopefully it wasn't too technical. But again, I just want to thank you so much for having me today, and I'll stick around for questions. And if we don't get to them, feel free to reach out over email as well.
Thank you.
Go ahead. Yeah, my name is Paul Wilson from the University of Wisconsin. Really glad to be here. I first want to thank Representative Madison and Senator Larson for having this conversation. I personally have lamented for a long time that our leaders in the state are not talking about energy enough, and both the climate impacts and the health impacts. And so it's exciting to be able to be part of this conversation. I've also been really excited that in this whole series, which I've been keeping up with, that we've had an MD on every single panel, because I think the health impacts are a really important thing to be focusing on. And so keeping our attention on that is a really important factor. Last, I'll say I'm going to be talking about nuclear energy, but I want to be clear that, in my opinion, there's a lot of room in this state for advances in solar and wind deployment. We need a lot more of those technologies as well. But as I'll try and make the case here today, they're not going to get us all the way there. And so while we need to make some near changes in making those things move forward, I'm going to talk to you about nuclear energy and some of its benefits and where the future technology is going. So you can jump to the next slide, please. So first, I think a key thing to recognize about nuclear energy, and one of the things that results in a lot of its benefits, is the density of energy. And so if you all hold up your pinky finger and look at just the last part after your last knuckle, that's the size of one uranium fuel pellet. And that contains enough energy as 3 barrels of oil, a ton of coal, or 17,000 cubic feet of natural gas. And that energy density really trickles through all of the ways we think about nuclear energy and why it has benefits for our energy system. Next slide. Perhaps obvious to many people here, but there's a lot of different technologies and different life cycle emissions from those technologies. And so, nuclear energy power plants, while they operate, produce almost no carbon into the atmosphere. Of course, if we account for their entire life cycle, there are some emissions. But I'd like to highlight things in this way, because on the left, you see there's what I've colored in red are the fossil fuels that are large emissions of CO2 and equivalents into our atmosphere. On the right, colored in green, are photovoltaics or wind or nuclear fission. Right? And I put these in the same category because I think it's not worth quibbling over the differences between these numbers that are in the tens. And what's more important is to focus from moving these numbers in the hundreds to numbers in the tens or lower. Next slide. And I think one of the important things, and this sort of ties back to my earlier remarks, is if we look at trying to get to a very low emission grid. And what this plot is trying to show is if we look from the left to the right, right now, I picked this number, just the live number from the electricity system yesterday. We were producing about 500 grams per kilowatt hour of carbon into the atmosphere from this part of the country. And we were paying, at least at a snapshot in the middle of the day yesterday, we were paying about $45 per megawatt hour for that electricity in MISO. If we look to driving ourselves to the right and getting lower and lower emissions, and you'll see all the way over on the right is this zero emission future. There's two main pathways we can think of. Well, there's many, but I'm going to highlight two here. One is to do it without the presence of low carbon firm dispatchable sources. Right? Nuclear energy is one of these. And the other one is to do it with those sources. And often you hear people talk about being able to do this without those firm dispatchable, what we used to call baseload sources. And what this is one study that I've adapted this from that was done about 10 years ago now, or 7 or 8 years ago. And what they looked at was looking out into the future. And the reason those bands are so large is rather than predicting a single cost of things in the future, they looked at a wide range of what they thought these technologies might cost. And the key takeaway is, in this early region, going from twice as good as we are now to 10 times as good as we are now, maybe it doesn't matter as much whether we include these technologies. And that's where the low-hanging fruit is in a state like Wisconsin. But if we want to get all the way to a zero carbon future and we exclude technologies like nuclear energy, the cheapest price we imagine that being in the future is more expensive than the highest price we would imagine it being if we did include technologies like nuclear energy. And so I think this is a key thing to focus on, is when we try and drive to that zero carbon future, we really need technologies that look like this. So next slide, please. So I think it's important to highlight some recent reversals and where the tides have really shifted for nuclear energy in the last 7 or 8 years. Perhaps the biggest headline one is Diablo Canyon in California. In 2016, they agreed to shut down this power plant. It's the last remaining nuclear power plant in California with 2 reactors operating there. And that shutdown was supposed to happen about now. But in 2021, they recognized that without Diablo Canyon, they would have energy shortages in California, in part because they had passed legislation to prevent new natural gas facilities from being built, and in part for other reasons of the way their energy system was developing. And so in a bipartisan reversal of interest, the state legislature, the federal government, and many players worked to keep Diablo Canyon open, and it will now continue to operate for at least another 20 years or so. Closer to home, Palisades is on Lake Michigan, just on the western part of Michigan. It closed in May 22, and it was sold to the company Entergy. Entergy owned it. It was sold to Holtec in June, and they were with the plan that they would decommission it, and within months they decided they would not do that. And in September, they announced they would reopen with support from the state government as well as the federal government. And just this year, they got their license. The first time ever a plant was converted from a decommissioning license to an operating license, and they're going to turn that reactor back on this year. 3 Mile Island, which many people know for other reasons, it's had one power plant that continued to operate until 2019 and was closed by Exelon. And just last year, Constellation Energy are going to reopen it as the Crane Clean Energy Center, and with a lot of support from Microsoft. Closer to home, Duane Arnold in Iowa is considering this, and Kewaunee is a site in Wisconsin which has been closed for 12 years. It's not likely that reactor will ever turn on again as it is, but that site is very attractive perhaps for building new reactor technology in Wisconsin. Next slide. So when we think about the future of nuclear technology, historically we've built very large reactors, thousands of megawatts at a time, and the 2 plants at Point Beach are about 600 megawatts each. And when we've done that, and we didn't do it for a long time, the last reactors we built prior to 2 that are now operating in Georgia, they started construction in the 70s, and then we had a long hiatus. In the late 2000s, they started constructing the Vogtle reactors in Georgia. They came online in the last few years. And frankly, they were very expensive and very over schedule. In the grand scheme of how they've affected the rate base in Georgia, it hasn't been as bad as it might have looked for a bunch of reasons. And so one of the questions we ask within the nuclear community today is how do we take the lessons learned from that relearning how to build nuclear power plants and apply it today? When you look at the AI data centers, which are a subtext of this whole conversation, they need reliable baseload power, maybe at this scale, and so that could be a point towards building more large reactors. Next slide, please. But because of the major investment that comes with, there's been a lot of interest in going to smaller reactors. These large reactors are a large single investment. They usually come with long construction times. Those single investments are $6, $10, $12 billion. Not a lot of companies are willing to put up that kind of money and have that at risk for the 4, 5, or 6 year construction time. And in many of our markets where they're deregulated around the country, that means there's no guaranteed rate of return. I know you had a speaker last session talk about the challenges of that whole scheme. And so there's increased interest in small modular reactors. One of the key benefits being the initial investment will just be smaller, less capital will be at risk, and hopefully shorter construction times and maybe engaging more factory manufacturing so that we can bring those facilities on faster. When we look at the economy of scale in the traditional reactor world, the economy of scale was to make reactors as large as possible. From an engineering and physics point of view, that made them cheaper. If we look to smaller reactors, the economy of scale will be to make as many of these reactors as possible, and so that you get the benefits of learning and things like that. Next slide. If we go even smaller, we get to something called microreactors, or sometimes people call them nuclear batteries. The idea here is they would be entirely manufactured in a factory and delivered as plug-and-play systems to sites. You sort of drop them in place, hook up the cables, turn them on, let them operate for 5 or 10 years until they're no longer useful, turn them off, bring in a new one, swap it out, and take the old one back to a factory for refurbishing or disposal. One of the things I think is interesting about this that connects to, I think, the last session is how this changes the social license for nuclear a little bit. When we're talking about reactors of this scale, it means it's something that communities and neighborhoods can actually have an active participation role in adopting, rather than the 1,000 megawatt plants that require large corporations and large regulatory environments. And so that's a sort of a speculation of looking to the future about how we can have more sort of citizen engagement in that process. None of these are being built, so there's challenges for what it will actually look like to be profitable. And to tie into the last speaker, there's also opportunities for these to providing industrial heat. So high temperature heat that Leah didn't talk about, reactors and nuclear energy is an opportunity to provide some of that in our manufacturing sector. Next slide. I'll move through this quickly. These are just some pictures of what these things might look like. Again, they've never been built, but to give you a sense of scale and what we're talking about. Next slide again. There's a few advanced reactor demonstrations happening around the country right now. In particular, there's one in Kemmerer, Wyoming. A company called TerraPower is building what's called the sodium-cooled fast reactor. An interesting thing about this one is that they have decoupled the reactor system from the grid with a thermal energy storage system, so they can run the reactor at full tilt all the time, but then extract the energy as the grid demand needs it from that energy storage system. The other one is the X-Energy project in Seadrift, Texas. I think the exciting thing about this one is that it's being built in partnership with Dow Chemical, where they're looking at their industrial system and would like the combined heat and power opportunity of a reactor to decarbonize their chemical processing. And they've committed to building at least 4 more of these on this site if the first step goes successfully. Both of these are funded 50-50 through the bipartisan infrastructure law with public funds. Next slide, please. I'll nearly finish up here looking at advanced nuclear fuel cycles. So there's a lot more interest being played in this looking forward. And this really addresses the waste management aspects of nuclear energy. Today, if you look at this picture, we move across those black arrows from left to right, mining uranium and eventually putting it in reactors. And the red arrow shows what our current federal policy is it will take that used fuel and ultimately store it underground. All the green arrows in the middle represent technology that we're familiar with and know how to use, but has never really been commercially viable to take that used nuclear fuel, separate chemically into different streams, put some of it back into reactors to produce more electricity, and greatly reduce the amount of waste that we actually ultimately need to store underground. So I think my next slide is the last one. So in summary, nuclear energy is very energy dense and therefore comes often with small impacts, both in the emissions and the land use. As we've done it historically, it's very capital intensive and it's in a very heavily regulated industry, which has created economic challenges, particularly in the last 15 years of very low or 20 years of very low natural gas prices. And there's a variety of technologies in the future that allow us to think of nuclear matching into our electricity system in new ways. So I'll be happy to answer any questions later on and stick around if there's any questions as well.
Hey, so I'm Jonathan Patz, and I'm going to be talking about the health consequences of our energy choices. And before I dive into my area of expertise, which is public health, and I'm going to be talking about the health gains, the health benefits from a low carbon energy sector. If we can go to the next slide, quick reminder from last week, Professor Greg Nemeth reminded us that we are in a different energy landscape. And what I mean by that is that, solar energy is really cheap now. And as of 2019, it's the cheapest way to generate electricity. So I wanted to just show a reminder slide from, there you go. Yeah, just a reminder from last week of the dramatically dropping price of solar on the left. And on the right, his graph showing that solar energy will become the dominant central form of energy, more so than oil and gas. So that's a review from last week. Now let's talk about energy options in Wisconsin. Next slide. So a team at the University of Wisconsin asked the question, could Wisconsin generate all of its energy in state from cleaner resources? And you can see this pie chart over on the upper right, the largest sector being utility scale solar, and on the bottom, onshore wind. Those would be the largest sources of clean energy, but you see around the chart some area for certainly efficiency, electricity efficiency, and that's on the user side, and building efficiency. Nuclear is part of that, and other sources of much cleaner energy than fossil fuels. As we look at this transitioning to these clean energy sources, there's one point that needs to be made. Hit the next one. And that is we need to have a just transition, a just energy transition. For example, we cannot burn any more coal, but we need to support coal mining communities during this transition. So it's a really important element to consider as we transition to cleaner energy. Next slide. So what would that clean energy mean for Wisconsin as far as health? These same scientists also looked at what it would mean if we got off of fossil fuels and we adopted that 100% in-state clean energy scenario that I just showed you. We would have almost 2,000 fewer deaths every year from cleaner air quality. We would see tens of thousands fewer cases of asthma exacerbation and 650 less heart attacks every year because of the improvement in the air quality from clean energy sources. Next. This sums up to about $21 billion every year in air pollution related savings, reduced deaths and hospitalizations and all the other aspects tied into healthcare costs, $21 billion every year in savings. And of course, with changes in energy, there are lots of new jobs. Next slide. The National Climate Assessment, they took a look at all these cost-benefit studies that asked the question, what is the cost of constructing new clean energy systems versus the benefit that would result from cleaner air quality? Burning coal kills a lot of people, right? So if you can get to clean energy, what does it mean? What's the cost versus the benefit? And you can see that the majority of studies where the health benefits not only offset the upfront costs, but many of them far exceed the cost. If any of you remember our great Clean Air Act in the United States, it's estimated that for every $1 investment in clean technology results in 30 to 40 times more benefits in environmental and health benefits. So not surprising that the health benefits, which can be enormous, can more than pay for themselves as far as these analysis. Next slide. So my team has conducted an analysis. In fact, Dr. Nick Mayu is in the back there who led this analysis, and he asked the question, what would happen if we decarbonize across sectors? What would the air quality changes be, and then subsequently, what would the health benefits be? Next slide. So Nick and his team found that cutting air pollution from burning fossil fuels would save more than 50,000 American lives every year. And that, cost-wise, that's equivalent to $600 billion in savings from reduced mortality, hospitalization, and other health costs. So it's something to be thinking about as we think about shifting our energy and recognizing how tied this is to our health. Next slide. This is a map of Nick's study showing, where you're going to see the most improvement as far as reductions in fine particulate matter, sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxides. And the darker the blue, the more the health benefit. And it's not surprising that you see in the Ohio River Valley, with all the coal-fired power plants that are still there, and other and methane generators as well. But you see a lot of improvement in that region. You see it in California, lots of cars in California. There's petroleum refineries down in Louisiana. But anyway, this is a map that shows where we'll see the most benefits. Next. So we've been talking about data centers, and you can see the cartoon. ChatGPT, why is my electric bill so high? So I'm not the expert in data centers, and I'm really grateful that our first speaker talked about data centers. Next slide. I'll just show a report that Kathy Kuntz, the sustainability director of Dane County, looking at future-proof AI centers. And I won't dwell on these recommendations. I pulled these out of about 6 or 7 recommendations, meeting renewable energy and grid demand and things like that that are important to consider. But if you hit the next button, my key reminder as a physician and researcher of environmental health is that if we're going to be backing up data centers with diesel generators, that inevitably will kill people and cause harm to downwind communities. So that's something that I know is an issue, but if it's going to be diesel generator backup, there are going to be health consequences. Next slide. So I want to just say that energy policy is one and the same as public health policy. Clean energy saves lives by the millions. Next. And we're in a pivotal moment that allows us to adopt a healthier and even cheaper electric grid. But we need legislation that incentivizes large energy users to choose power sources that promote human health and flourishing for Wisconsin communities. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much to Senator Larson, Representative Madison, and our amazing panel for those great in-depth insights. So what we've heard today is that Wisconsin faces urgent energy choices, but these choices are also full of opportunity. Dr. Stokes highlighted the potential in the manufacturing sector. Dr. Wilson underscored nuclear's role in a clean, reliable grid. And Dr. Patch showed that clean energy could be the greatest public health opportunity of our lifetimes. It's clear that Wisconsin and our country right now are in an energy emergency. Demand is rising from new industries, especially AI. Reliability is strained, and ratepayers are paying the price through skyrocketing energy bills. We need quickly deployable solutions like solar, storage, and the build out of transmission to cut costs, keep the lights on, and cut health harming pollution. At the same time, Wisconsin needs to continue investing in the technologies that will define the future. It's a dual moment. We need to act to protect ratepayers and bolster the workforce while preparing for the next generation of energy solutions. State action is absolutely essential in this moment. The Public Service Commission needs more power. They need the authority to move at the speed these overlapping crises demand. State legislation can really empower and require the PSC to help lower bills, strengthen communities, and create a thriving economy through the clean energy transition. Just wanted to summarize a little bit and open up for questions for our panelists. If we have one, I can go ahead and read some from the.
No, I haven't. I was gonna. Can I state it?
Oh, yeah, go ahead. If you want to state your name and then.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, Claire Gervais, I'm a family medicine doctor. I've been in practice for 20 plus years. I'm with Healthy Climate Wisconsin, Wisconsin Environmental. Not really representing them, but I'm just involved with the board, etc. But I had a question for Jonathan Patz, who I know quite well. If he would just maybe comment about the health effects of uranium mining and maybe nuclear waste. Since today we're focusing on nuclear, since we know that the radioactive dust contaminates the soil and water, associated with kidney disease, cancers, birth defects, could you comment about that? I don't know if you know a ton about it, but I know there are issues.
I'm going to repeat the question just so folks on Zoom can hear if that's okay. The question is for Dr. Patz, and it is about the health effects of uranium mining and nuclear.
Right. I will only say a few things because I'm not well versed in that, other than to say that there are occupational hazards to all types of energy. There are certainly the issues of radiation exposure that needs to be controlled for. To my understanding, there are far fewer accidents compared to coal mining and fossil fuel industry. So, I think there are definitely risks. There are very few risks in renewable energy. I mean, someone will fall off of a wind turbine occasionally. Well, but compared to other sources, renewables are really incredible as far as few work hazards. But there are some of the issues, but the occupational exposures from nuclear are far, far less than fossil fuels. You want to say that?
I mean, I guess I'll just, there's a couple of specific questions that Claire had there. For uranium mining in particular, increasingly is done without sending humans underground. And so the risks occupationally and to the public from uranium mining are decreasing always. There's a terrible legacy of uranium mining in this country. During the Cold War in the Four Corners area of the United States, a lot of uranium mill tailings were left without much care, and the Navajo people bore the brunt of that, and it's still being understood exactly what that consequence was. We don't do a lot of uranium mining today in the United States. Most of it is happening internationally, and increasingly that's happening with techniques that don't expose humans to a lot of risk.
Excellent. The next question is about different energy sources. So last week, solar was presented as a solution. This person asked, what about windmills? Is there going to be a presentation regarding wind energy? If anyone wants to speak about the role of wind energy as a solution, I think that could be open for any of the panelists.
I'm happy to speak about it if it's helpful. I've written many papers about wind energy. So wind energy is a source that can be used onshore and even within the Great Lakes. That's an offshore option within the Great Lakes to create electricity. It has generally a higher capacity factor than solar. What does that mean? It means that it's operating more hours of the year. So that's a benefit of wind. And it also can be complementary to solar because, of course, solar is operating when the sun is up during the day, and wind it can operate in different seasons of the year and at night. So there's benefits to it. The challenge is that wind before the Trump administration was struggling in the United States in terms of financing and the amount of investment. A lot of the best sites onshore, although certainly not all of them, have already been developed. There's also growing local opposition to onshore wind. I've written many papers about this. And so sometimes people don't want to have wind in their communities, and that can be a really big barrier to development. So the Trump administration has, of course, made many, many actions against the wind industry, making the industry have even harder times. They're, for example, canceling existing projects that are under construction, which creates massive uncertainty, and you're seeing lawsuits. For example, wind developers, I believe Ørsted is currently suing the federal government. So the wind industry is struggling right now, whether that's onshore, offshore, and some of the key factors are the costs of development, interest rates, local opposition, and of course, the Trump administration has been putting up enormous amounts of red tape against the industry. So that is something that I'm sure you could have somebody come and speak about, but it is an industry that is struggling at this exact moment.
And if I can just add, the health concerns of wind energy have been mostly overrated. There have been many studies showing there's no effect of flicker electromagnetic fields. The wind, the sound is very low in decibels, like a dishwasher. So there's been a lot of talk about wind energy being harmful to health. All of the studies don't bear that out. So I would not worry about the health issues about wind.
Excellent. Thank you. And we will take this last question as we're running up on time, which is a question I love as an advocate. What clean energy policies are you all currently working on or exploring? And what do you need to enact them with regards to rates, grants into the future? I can hop in and mention one that I think is really interesting. In Wisconsin, there is some movement and momentum around establishing an integrated resource planning process in Wisconsin, which is a very valuable procedural tool for the Public Service Commission to consider multiple factors in their energy decisions for what happens with Wisconsin's grid and their energy mix. Currently, there's a lot of information coming in from the utilities, but that kind of gives a very narrow scope of what they can and can't do with their decision making. We need to empower the government and as a third party here, not acting just on behalf of industry, so they can consider things like public health and emissions and cost to ratepayers when they're making decisions about which energy sources to approve. So establishing an integrated resource process would be very valuable in doing that in Wisconsin. I will just reference Michigan is a place that recently gave their PSC more power to do this. As they're seeing kind of all of these effects come right now, they want their PSC to be prepared to act on these overlapping crises. So I would just mention that one, but definitely want to defer to our panelists on other recommendations to the extent they can speak on this.
I can be brief. Thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed hearing Dr. Wilson and Dr. Patz's talks as well. As I mentioned, there's two big things I think Wisconsin could do. The legislature could pass a program to incentivize early action of industrial facilities to electrify. This is like what Colorado's been doing. They put $168 million towards the effort. I think they're doing it through a tax credit. California also has a program called Indigo that's $90 million, and that just starts to get the process going. So I'd really recommend that. The second thing, which is done more at the PSC, would be creating those preferential rates for electrification of industrial facilities, because if we don't have lower electricity rates, these facilities won't be in the money when they electrify. So those would be the two things that I would really highly recommend.
I would say most of my interest recently has been in supporting lawmakers in this building as they sort of ask questions about nuclear energy, try to understand the opportunities better, and make sure that the policies that are being generated are addressing the sort of justice questions that Jonathan brought up, to make sure that all of our communities are having the right perspective brought into those questions and conversations.
And I'll just say that my team is looking at the energy transition across sectors, so not only electricity generation, but also the potential health gains from decarbonizing the transportation sector. And of course, we can go so far with electric cars, provided that the source of electricity is clean, but we also can design cities for people, not just for automobiles. And Madison is a great place where we've got platinum ranked biking, and we're able to get around by bikes and mass transit, things like that. So there are lots of health gains, thinking about promoting physical fitness and reduce stress.
Excellent. I think that's all we have time for questions. I'll hand it back to the representative, and I think panelists have a few minutes to answer some that are coming in for them. So I'll hand it back to you. Thank you.
Awesome. So as we close out Energy University, one, I want to thank everyone who's been here since day one. You guys have, it's been a long 3 weeks where we've had many conversations about moving towards a clean energy economy and different pathways to get there. Like we've said at every single one of these panels, there's a bunch of different thoughts about how we get to our clean energy future, as well as meeting our energy demand in the state, and differing opinions on that. But if we aren't having these conversations now, if we didn't, these conversations that we should have had years ago, we do ourselves a disservice. And there are a bunch of folks in the room. Raise your hand if you're a legislator in the space, who are working on a gambit of different policy solutions to get Wisconsin on the right path. And a lot of the panelists who have been in this space, sitting in these seats, are a crucial piece of the legislative solutions that we will be developing over time. And we hope to continue these conversations because we know that our energy needs and the topics we've discussed up to this point aren't enough. There's a lot and are more complex than what we've discussed at this point. But this lays the foundation for a bold and a bright future for Wisconsin and for every community, whether you live in Milwaukee, Beloit, or Superior, and anything in between.
Thank you to my partner in good, Representative Madison, for helping to put this together. Thank you to all of you for attending this and for the actions that we are collectively going to take to make Wisconsin a clean energy hub, and honor the legacy of our predecessors, making sure that we have a clean energy future that we're handing to them, where we take account of the air, water, and land, and not just, the other things. So thank you, and also to our panelists, the ones who were here before, as well as the folks who are here today. We really appreciate your expertise. It means a lot. So thank you, Jonathan, Paul, Courtney, and then Leah online. Let's give them a round of applause, and let's get going to our clean energy future. Thank you.